So in today's lesson, we're going to be learning about the human circulatory system. So I want you to take a look here at this diagram I have of a human being, and I want you to tell me, well, based on what you're looking at here, what would you say are the main three parts of the human circulatory system? Right? Of course, there are different ways that we can subdivide this, but by and large, what are the three essential components? Well, I'm hoping when you look at this diagram that what comes to mind is certainly the heart, right? The heart seems to be at the center of all of that. Next, we have blood. Well, the blood is certainly an important part of that circulatory system, right? Carrying around a variety of different types of blood cells and other components. And lastly, we can group blood vessels all together. Now, some of you may have gone on further and said, well, we have arteries and we have veins, and certainly I would put those in the category of blood vessels. So what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at that central component of the circulatory system, which is the heart. And so because it's so important, I want to spend some extra time talking about it. So first off, I want to talk about the different types of tissues that we see here. You may want to pause the video and try to think about, first of all, what the different types of tissues are that we discussed in class, and also what types of tissues we might see incorporated in constructing this heart. Now, first of all, I would say that we have epithelial tissue. And so the epithelial tissue we're going to see, remember, an epithelial tissue is a covering. And so we're going to see a covering outside and inside the heart. We're certainly going to have some nerve tissue, right? Nervous tissue is what's going to allow for the heart to beat. And if you're taking grade 11 biology, you'll learn a whole lot more about how heartbeat gets created. We also have some connective tissue. In this case, the connective tissue is blood, right? The main function of the heart is to help circulate blood throughout the body. And so the blood is that connective tissue. Lastly, we have cardiac muscle tissue. And we can see that here, right? There's a thick layer of muscle, and it's thicker in certain areas, but it's largely comprised of muscle, right? The job of the heart is to pump. It is a pumping organ. And so the muscle is going to be really important for that. Now, worth mentioning a couple of other things about that muscle tissue because it's pretty special. Cardiac muscle tissue, we find it only in the heart. And what's neat about it is that those cells contract all at once, and that helps to push the blood around. I'm going to show you a little animation I found here that shows that in action. And certainly there are lots of videos, if you're interested, online about this, these cardiomyocytes, and you can see them if you look closely. They're all kind of contracting and relaxing in sync with each other, which is pretty cool. All right, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at a heart that is beating, right? And so we know that our heart beats, and that heartbeat can change depending on a variety of circumstances. Now, I have a watch that monitors my heart rate, and I know what factors can affect my heart rate. And I want you to think about maybe 2 or 3 if you can. I'm going to talk about them now. So one that certainly comes to mind is physical activity. I know if I'm out for some kind of physical activity, then my heart rate will go up, right? And there are reasons for that. You know, if I'm exercising, my oxygen demand is greater, and I'm going to need to create more energy for my body. And so as a result, my heart is going to pump blood to my lungs at a different rate. Stress. I don't know if you're like me and in elementary school and high school doing presentations in front of other people used to really get me worked up, and I felt like my heart was beating out of my chest. So certainly stress has an impact. Temperature for sure, depending if it's hot outside or cold outside. And lastly, your health. And health may be related to these other factors that we've mentioned before, right? People who are maybe less healthy, a little bit of physical activity might cause their heartbeat to increase relative to somebody who might be in a healthier state. Now, so I also want to talk about tissue. We know that, we've talked about this before, that the heart is covered by a smooth layer of epithelial cells. But I want you to think about, well, why might we need epithelial cells on the outside of the heart? What might be the function of that? Why not just have muscle cells? What is the function of having epithelial tissue on the inside of the heart? Right? Again, why not just have that muscle tissue? So let's talk about that. Well, first of all, remember that your heart is existing inside your body cavity, right? And it's right next to a whole bunch of other, of other organs, specifically the lungs. And so as your heart is beating, it's rubbing up against those other organs, and other organs are also going to be, like the lungs, for instance, expanding and then relaxing. And so all of that is going to result in some friction. And so the epithelial tissue just helps to kind of protect the heart from some of that damage. Now, in terms of the inside of the heart, what I'm hoping you thought about was that blood is flowing through that heart, right? And so the fact that it's lined with a smooth layer of epithelial cells is going to just allow that blood to flow through the heart and reduce friction in that capacity as well. So moving on to blood vessels. We've talked about the heart. Now we're going to move on to the second component of the circulatory system, which is the blood vessels. And so most of you probably thought about arteries and or veins when we talked about blood vessels. And so I want to talk about the difference between arteries and veins. And also I want to talk about these things called capillaries as well. Okay, so in general, we will say that an artery will move blood from the heart to other parts of the body. So in other words, away from the heart. So I always think artery away from the heart. Now, most often that blood is going to be reoxygenated, ready to deliver oxygen, but not always. There are a couple of exceptions to that. And so, but by and large, the best way to define an artery is a blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart. Artery away. Okay, now veins, you can see, are colored in blue in this diagram here. And so what that's meant to indicate is that the blood coming from the vein is going back to the heart to get reoxygenated. Now, again, that is by and large true. However, there are some exceptions. The best way to think about it is to not think about oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, but just to think about the direction of flow. Okay, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the structure of arteries and veins, but right now I want you to know veins carry blood towards the heart. Okay, now, arteries are going to be carrying blood away, high pressure. Their walls, we're going to see, are going to be a lot more thick, and that's going to prevent some bursting. Okay, as a result, we're going to look at some of the structure that supports that function. Okay, veins are going to be a little bit thinner. They're going to carry blood under low pressure. And they're going to have a valve that we're going to take a look at to help ease the movement of blood back to the heart. Okay, now, capillaries. Capillaries are in between veins and arteries. And, what they are these tiny, tiny little thin-walled blood vessels with very high surface area to allow for materials like substances like oxygen, like carbon dioxide, to diffuse across them. So they're really, really thin, but there are a lot of them. So that allows for a high surface area and a speedy diffusion of materials across those particular blood vessels. Here we can see, right? And in fact, they're so thin, their diameter is so thin that they allow for only just one red blood cell to pass at a time, which is pretty cool. I'm just going to go back to the last slide here. And right, so we have arteries, we have veins. We're not going to talk about it too much in this year. There are other smaller blood vessels that lead up to the capillaries, but that capillary is sort of what exists in between veins and arteries to allow for blood to travel between those two major kind of classes of blood vessels and to allow for material to diffuse quickly across them. There's our capillaries. So now, here is a nice few diagrams to compare and contrast the structure of our arteries, our veins, and our capillaries. You'll notice that the capillaries are very thin-walled, and that again just helps with, the easing of materials diffusing across them. They're also much smaller in the diameter. Now, our arteries and veins both have, muscular walls. They're both thicker than our capillaries. But you'll notice the artery has a much thicker wall. And again, that just helps to support the fact that it's being, blood is being carried under a much higher pressure in these blood vessels. Okay, now our veins are carrying blood at much lower pressures, so the walls of the vein are less thick. But we also see that it has this contraption here, a valve, and that valve helps to make sure that blood is only traveling in the veins in one particular direction, because again, they are under low pressure. I'm going to talk about the veins a little bit more. And so here we have a vein. Now I want you to imagine that, some artery has pushed blood towards your legs and away from your heart, and it's all oxygenated, ready to donate that oxygen to the cells that need it in the muscles in your lower leg. Now, that blood now is deoxygenated, and it needs to travel back to the heart and then eventually to the lungs to get oxygenated again. Now, remember that blood has to travel, that deoxygenated blood that is now in a vein, has to travel back to the heart. Now, if it's in your leg, it's traveling against gravity. So these little valves, we can see, are helping to prevent some backflow there, right? And so the valve opens. Every time your heart beats, the valves are going to open. That's going to allow blood to go up kind of to the next level, if you were. But then the valves close, so that blood can't go backwards, right? So here we see some venous blood in action, flow in action, but those one-way valves help to prevent that blood from pooling and help to get it back to the heart and then to the lungs for reoxygenation. So I want to talk to you very, very briefly about blood flow. I shouldn't say through the heart. I should say like within the circulatory system here. Next year, you're going to learn a little bit more about what the different structures in the heart are. That's a little bit beyond the scope of grade 10 science, but you certainly will see that in grade 11 biology if you're taking that course. So before we get to the details here, let's take a minute to examine this diagram and put it in context. So we have our heart, and we know that our heart is going to circulate blood not only through the body, but also it's going to circulate blood to the lungs. And so the job of the lungs is to cause that blood, those red blood cells, to become reoxygenated, right? So, but how does it do that, right? Where does it start? Where does blood start? Where does it end? What is this cycle looking like? So let's break that down. So it's a cycle, so I have to kind of choose a starting point. I'm going to choose the veins that are bringing the deoxygenated blood from the body. So here that means I'm starting kind of here. So here's a vein, right? And it's got all this blood that needs to get reoxygenated because all that oxygen, got used up in the body somewhere. So that blood is going to be brought back to the heart via the veins. And it's going to go from the body into the right chambers of the heart. Now you might be thinking, well, isn't this the left side of the diagram? What the heck? But remember, if you were pointing to this side of your heart, it would indeed be the right-hand side. Remember that we're looking at this in a mirror, but of course a mirror inverts images laterally, right? So this is actually, if this were your heart, it would be on the right side. So blood travels to the right side of the heart. Oh, where's it going there? From there, it goes to the lungs, right? So you have an artery, remember artery away, that is bringing deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So this is a case where your blood in your artery is not actually oxygenated. Okay, it's going to bring it to the lungs, right? So your respiratory system, which we're going to talk about in another lesson, is going to allow oxygen to enter the bloodstream. Your blood at your lungs is going to get reoxygenated. Once it's nicely oxygenated, it's going to travel back to the heart. Remember now, any blood vessel going back to the heart is going to be a vein. So this right here is actually still is a vein, even though it contains oxygenated blood. So the vein is going to bring oxygenated blood back into the left side of the heart, right? So it's all oxygenated and it's ready to go and be pumped out to the body to continue that cycle, to deliver more oxygen to the cells in the body and tissues that need it. Okay, so that will happen via an artery. Remember, artery away. So that's the quick and dirty of how blood flow works, from the body to the heart, to the lungs, and back in a nice closed cycle, of course. Then we would go right back to the top here and start that cycle again. It's a circulatory system because ideally it is a closed system, unless, of course, there's some sort of disruption. Now, I do want to point out here that in between our arteries and veins, we also see these capillaries where that oxygen is diffusing across the membrane of the capillary and into your body tissue cells. Okay, well, that is it for now. The only last piece of this puzzle, we've talked about our heart, we've talked about the blood vessels, we also have to talk about blood itself. And so there is a short worksheet for you to fill in to become familiar with the components of blood, types of blood cells and their functions. As always, reach out with any questions that you have. I'm more than happy to help clarify or practice with you. Just reach out via our Zoom.